The Pit of Snakes, Ancient Mesopotamia. The ancient Mesopotamians weren't exactly known for talking things out and giving people slaps on the wrist for doing something bad. Instead, they used fear to tell people to never mess with the law, and there's nothing more dreadful than a pit of snakes. This punishment is exactly how it sounds. It's a deep pit of snakes filled to the brim with slithering danger noodles who won't hesitate to fill you up with venom the moment you're thrown into the hole. It's not exactly the kind of venom that gives you superpowers. Instead, it's the type that would turn your insides into mush. The pit of snakes, however, wasn't an everyday punishment they would give out to anybody. That means jaywalking in the streets of ancient Mesopotamia wouldn't get you sent to the pit to become an all-you-can-eat buffet for snakes. Instead, it's reserved for the most serious crimes, including murder or stealing your neighbor's goat. But there's also a deeper meaning behind the pit of snakes. Mesopotamians saw snakes as symbols of danger and the very embodiment of human phobia. They were associated with the dark forces of the underworld in mythology, so dumping a criminal into this pit is kind of like turning the snakes into the underworld's hands, or in this case, the fangs of dark justice. The whole process was also meant to be unforgettable for everyone who ever saw or heard about this punishment. It wasn't meant to be quick either, because it can take a while for the venom to kick in and kill the criminal, and it sent out a quick and lasting message: don't mess with the law or else you get the fangs. Suffocating by ash, ancient Rome. Imagine being in ancient Rome and you feel so annoyed by your neighbor that you burn him to ash. Of course, the authorities aren't going to let this one go. They decide to punish you using the very same as your neighbor turned into, kind of like his way of going on a revenge tour from the afterlife. That punishment is called suffocating by ash. It was ashes to ashes, dust to justice. When you burn something, you leave ash behind. The Romans saw using ash as a way of balancing things out. You turn something into ash, you die by ash. So if you burn another person's property, the Romans would use ash in a poetic way of unaliving you. It was clear that the Romans loved their justice, with a side of symbolism. It worked by putting you in a small room, like a chamber or pit. From there, hot ash would be poured in, and you would eventually suffocate because the ash would fill up the room, leaving no room for air. The heat of the ash also adds a layer of torment that makes you suffer. Suffocating by ash was probably the inspiration for the song "Take My Breath Away," because it literally kills you by taking your breath away. The punishment was a way of telling people never to play with fire, literally and figuratively. Blindfolding by sunlight, medieval Persia. It probably sounds like a sunbathing session gone wrong, but blindfolding by sunlight was a severe punishment that gave you a fate worse than death. After all, nothing is worse than losing your eyesight. This punishment might sound simple, but it was brutal, cheap, and unfortunately didn't come with a complimentary pair of shades. Imagine getting restrained and forced to stare at the blinding midday sun with no SPF or even a trendy visor. It's hard enough trying to look at the sun on a brisk winter's day. Now picture yourself in the shoes or sandals of those unlucky enough to be sentenced to an all-day solar staring contest. They didn't get the option of tinted lenses to add a bit of cool factor to their suffering. Instead, it's just straight up staring without the luxury of looking away. A literal can't take your eyes off it situation. The longer you look at the sun without protection, your poor corneas begin to scream for mercy, soaking up all that UV like a sponge. Before you know it, you're well on your way to something called photokeratitis. Picture a sunburn, but instead of peeling skin, it's your eyeballs taking the hit. This wasn't just a brief flash of pain. The exposure here was so extreme it often resulted in permanent damage. You might still be able to see, but it'd be more of a hazy, painful reminder of your sightseeing punishment. Lead sprinkler, medieval Europe. Setting off the sprinkler had a different meaning in medieval Europe. Their sprinklers didn't get you wet with water, but got you screaming in pain with molten lead. That's the lead sprinkler in action. This torture method was particularly popular during the darker times of the medieval era because it was one of the best ways of punishing people while forcing them to confess. It was a simple device that kind of looked like a simple salt shaker. Imagine a metal rod with a cup with small holes at the end, but instead of seasoning your food with salt, it used molten lead. With a wrist flick, your executioner sprinkles the contents onto your skin. Imagine touching a frying pan while you're grilling food. Now imagine feeling the same pain all over your body. That's what it feels like when you're at the wrong end of a lead sprinkler punishment. They used lead instead of any other metal because it has a low melting point, making it easier to turn into molten liquid that stays super hot for a while. Of course, lead is very cheap, making it a hot deal. Once molten, it doesn't burn your skin, but sticks to your body like a clingy axe. The droplets cling and burrow into the skin, leaving deep and agonizing burns. But the worst part is that they'd target sensitive parts, such as your eyes, face, chest, or downstairs area. This punishment, however, wasn't used used for regular criminals, it was a way of persuading people like heretics and witches into confessing whatever the torturers wanted, sort of like a medieval version of peer pressure, but with a lot more molten metal involved. Boiling. Edo period, Japan. During the Edo period, the Japanese boiled other things instead of eggs for their ramen noodles. The country was under the strict rule of the Tokugawa shogunate, which placed a high value on law and order. To keep crime and rebellion under control, they made punishments intense and memorable, giving people the most intense hot spring experience they could ever have. If you were one of the criminals punished through boiling, you'd be put in a huge cauldron of water. But if they wanted you deep fried, they'd be boiling oil instead. As soon as it's bubbling and steaming, you'd be placed in it. Think of it as an unfortunate hot tub experience, or a simulation of what happens to chicken at KFC. Naturally, meeting a boiling end wasn't exactly a quiet affair. Your cries of agony would echo through town, a grim reminder that in Edo, Japan, the authorities were not messing around. Drawing and quartering, medieval England. Drawing and quartering was medieval England's way of making you look like an action figure with removable limbs and body parts. But it wasn't the same fun experience you would have if you were playing with your collectible figures, because you were the victim of this sick punishment. It was basically the king's way of saying he doesn't like you, because he gives you a send-off reserved for the biggest crimes, including treason. The drawing part involved being dragged through the streets, typically on a cart. Think of it as a really morbid parade float. But the ride wasn't designed for comfort, and it definitely wasn't a festive parade. Instead, it was more of a gruesome spectacle aimed at making everyone rethink about crossing the king, because you're going to be shamed as you're dragged across the streets. Once you've reached the gallows, they'd hang you in a non-fatal way. It was more of a way of hurting you while making you look like a human piñata. But just when you think the festivities were over, they cut you down to start the worst part of the punishment. The quartering part is when they'll tie each of your limbs to a separate horse. These beasts would then pull you in different directions, turning you into the world's bloodiest tug of war. It's a DIY disassembly project that makes IKEA assembly instructions look like child's play. Finally, your parts will be displayed in various locations as a warning to others, because nothing says don't mess with the king better than a few body parts hanging around town looking like sick Christmas decorations. Blood Eagle, Viking Age. The Blood Eagle is a punishment that doesn't take the cake, but literally takes the lungs. It was like the Vikings' version of the boogeyman tale, but instead of a supernatural monster hiding under the bed, they scared kids with stories about a punishment so gruesome even the toughest Viking chieftain would puke. If you're condemned to suffer the Blood Eagle, you'd be tied down as if you're on an operating table. Your executioner would start by slicing your back open, all without anesthesia knocking you out, making you feel every inch of your flesh getting ripped. If that isn't nightmare fuel enough, your ribs are then severed from your spine, enough to make even the bravest warriors start reconsidering their life choices. But that's just the opening act. After that, your ribs will get pulled out of your body, showcasing your lungs and organs. Your lungs would then be put over your shoulders, resembling a wing formation that pays homage to Odin's favorite bird. That's where you get the eagle part of the Blood Eagle, a unique aesthetic touch to your death. The problem is that there's nothing feathery about this punishment, because it's not only painful, but incredibly brutal, making you feel every ounce of pain every step of the way. This wasn't the kind of eagle you wanted to soar with. Historians, however, debate whether the Blood Eagle was real or just a terrifying legend crafted to keep Viking kids from acting up. Whatever the case, the Blood Eagle was reserved for the most despised enemies, or those who committed serious offenses against Viking leaders. It was a very public and memorable way to encourage you to stay loyal. You could say it was their way of sending a spine-tingling message. Tire execution, 20th century Africa. There was a darker time in South Africa when authorities were great at accessorizing in the most brutal way. They did so through necklacing, which isn't as posh as it sounds, but is a punishment that made you go out in flames. If you were punished for a crime, you'd be made to wear a rubber tire doused in gasoline around your neck. Then it's set on flames, giving you a flaming accessory that wouldn't make any fashionista jealous. In most cases, necklacing would result in severe injury or death. You would die either from the fumes suffocating you or from the pain of getting burned alive. If you did survive necklacing, you'd be left with serious burns that would make you look like you have a permanent necklace around your neck. It was a social or political punishment where certain black African groups would punish collaborators or oppressors in a way that symbolized the community's anger. The tire was the symbol of the people wrapping its hands around your neck, as if they wanted to choke the life out of you. Meanwhile, the flames represented their anger, like an angsty teenager's rage towards his parents. It was mostly used in far-flung communities that had been abandoned by the justice system during the apartheid era. However, necklacing wasn't universally supported, even within communities that were facing oppression. Nelson Mandela, the iconic anti-apartheid leader, condemned this practice for its extreme cruelty, believing that they needed to find better ways to seek justice. After all, turning someone into a human barbecue isn't exactly a step toward peace. Forced organ removal, 20th century. If you live in an authoritarian regime where a dictator is calling the shots, there's a good chance forced organ removal is a secret punishment for prisoners, rebels, or any enemy of the government. That's because it hits two birds with one stone. In this case, it's more like two organs with one scalpel. Essentially, forced organ removal involves removing or harvesting a person's organs without their consent. It's usually for transplantation or making a quick buck in the organ black market. However, because it's illegal to harvest someone's organs, authoritarian governments use prisoners and enemies of the state as their organ farms. After all, no one's going to be missing them. The only problem is that organs don't grow back. This way, it's a two-in-one approach where you punish the guy for a serious crime without letting their valuable organs go to waste. Imagine being detained for rebellion. Suddenly, the president's wife needs a new heart, and you are compatible. That means you'd have to say goodbye to your heart because you're going to go under the knife pretty soon. And they do this while you're still alive, because they want the organ to be as fresh as possible for transplant. Sure, it's a crime and a big human rights violation, but good luck getting those authoritarian governments to take a hint. If you happen to be brave enough to step up and tell them to stop what they're doing, your kidneys might be next on the list of organs that will soon be harvested. Medical castration, 20th century. If you're a real horn dog with sexual urges that rival Diddy, you're going to find yourself in real trouble, especially if you're a bit too aggressive at putting your junk anywhere as long as there's a hole it fits in. So if that's the case, chemical castration would be the authorities' go-to punishment for your crimes. This punishment is reserved for people convicted of certain sex crimes. That's because they believe the only way to stop them from being too sexual is to cut down those overly active testosterone levels. In the past, they did this by chopping your pee-pee, but because getting your junk trimmed down was a bit too cruel, they resorted to chemical castration. The difference here is that there's no need to chop anything off. Instead, they use chemicals to block your hormones and reduce testosterone levels, effectively dialing down those unwanted urges. These chemicals, called anti-androgens, inhibit or stop the production of testosterone, which lowers sexual drive and aggressive behaviors. So the less likely you are to get a happy ending in that department, the less likely you'll feel the need to, shall we say, get any hands-on experience that could lead to trouble. As long as you're on this medication, your urges are kept on mute, making them much less likely to pop back up unannounced. This punishment has been tried in places like South Korea, Poland, and some US states. It's like an all-in-one special. It's meant to stop repeat offenders and keep their urges in check. On the other hand, it serves as a form of punishment because it keeps you under control as if your penis is on a leash. Think of it as the pause button on your need to put that thing inside someone. Generational punishment, modern-day North Korea. Let's say you're living in modern-day North Korea, and you and your family members are treated worse than every member of your community. You're forced into hard labor, living in poverty, and doing all this because, get this, your great-grandfather once called a member of the Kim family chubby. Yes, one comment, and now you're paying for Grandpa's inability to keep his mouth shut. That's basically how generational punishment works. This punishment means your fate is determined not just by your actions, but by your family's past. If someone commits a crime, like attempting to escape the country, the punishments don't stop with that guy. Instead, their whole family gets a starring role in the misery show, sometimes for 3 generations. It's the gift that keeps on giving. The practice is rooted in the idea of collective responsibility. North Korea believes that family ties are strong enough that if one member does something bad, the rest must suffer. So if you're born into a guilty family, congratulations, because you'll have a lifelong bad credit score stamped on your forehead. Families can be sent to labor camps, where the conditions are worse than that summer boot camp you had when you were younger. Or you could find yourself getting branded as the worst community member. People will ignore you as if you're carrying the plague. Kids in guilty families can forget about good education or decent jobs, so the cycle of poverty and oppression spins on, like a washing machine stuck on the miserable setting.